So this week we're going to talk about how to plan your project and how to use planning tools to make sure you have a really clear structure. So some of the planning tools you might use are the annotated bibliography, free write and looping, clustering, and other visual organizers, which you've probably experimented with before, and outlines, whether they're formal or informal. And again, you've probably experimented with those before. They're very common. So the annotated bibliography, you've already done an annotated bibliography, so you're ahead of the game on that. Try using tags, section headers, colors, and other techniques to organize your bibliography now. So you had a formal annotated bibliography that you just turned in, but now you're using your bibliography as a tool. So you might organize it into subsections. For instance, I'm currently working a um, on a study on the efficacy of National Novel Writing Month as a teaching tool for learning writing. If you're not familiar with it, National Novel Writing Month is a um, yearly event. It's international, where people take on this challenge to write 50,000 words in 30 days. And it sounds crazy, and it kind of is, but it's actually easier than it sounds. Um, anyway, so to do this, I've had to put together a bibliography. So I've come up with some categories for what kinds of sources I'm using in my bibliography. And you can see this here on this slide. So I've got primary sources, which is I'm proposing a survey that has to be approved by the IRB. I might do some interviews with some students in the process. I've got my personal observations. I've been participating in it since 2005 at various levels, so I can use that. And I've also got the sort of the handbook to the event that's written by the founder of the event that describes how it should go. So I've got primary sources, which are the things that I'm specifically analyzing and contributing something new to the conversation with. And that's really important, because when we do this kind of original research, what we're looking for is what is it that hasn't been looked at already or hasn't been observed or noted, and how can we contribute that to the conversation. So then I'm looking at 3 different categories for my secondary sources. Secondary sources are the things that talk about what you're talking about. So I've got other people's personal experiences that they've already published, and there's several of these. And then for this example, I've just chosen to put 2 from each category. And so I've got people experiencing their own relationship with National Novel Writing Month, and I can use that as data. Then I've also got, there's a couple of peer-reviewed studies out there already. They're not very in-depth, which is why I need to do the study. But there is one that shows that an event called a write-in, where people get together to work on their projects, can be effective in generating more text. And there's another one that shows the use of it in children's classrooms with modified versions of the rules. And then I've also got other sources that don't talk specifically about National Novel Writing Month. And this is great if you had trouble finding sources that talked about your topic. This is sort of your catch-all, where you're like, there's theory that I can, through analysis, extend into what I'm looking at. So for my study, I'm looking at, well, what are some of the things that we already know about how people learn how to write? And so I've got a few articles on that. So another technique that we can use besides just categorizing your bibliography is free writing and looping. So free writing is where you just set a timer and you write for any amount of time. I recommend starting with a 10-minute timer. It can be exhausting to do more than that if you're not practiced at it. And you just write whatever comes into your head, even if it's absolutely ridiculous. Looping is where you take those free writes and you do very short free writes, so maybe only 2 to 5 minutes, and you highlight your the most important parts that you wrote in that previous highlight, or in that previous free write, and then you go ahead and do another free write. And that's why it's called looping, because you keep returning back to the topics in progression. So let's take a look at how that might. This is a sample free write. Now, it's very coherent because, one, I'm pretty practiced at the discipline of saying I'm going to write about this topic. For another, this is a topic I've been working on for a long time, so I've had time to put together my thoughts. So yours might not look this organized, but even so, notice the very informal style, and notice how I don't stop myself from just asking random questions, and I don't concern myself with, are my sentences perfectly grammatical? That's not important in a free write. Then, if I wanted to loop, I take a section of that and I say, I talked about identity in that one. Let's do a free write on identity. And so I start going on about identity. And then I like this sentence. And so I'm like, okay, let's go back to this. So what is this problem where students in composition classes don't identify as writers, which means that it's, why is that an issue? Well, as I answered, if we tend to resist learning if we don't try. So I'm like, okay, so this is the problem. They're not identifying this way. So then I start saying, okay, so I have a question. How do we fix that? And that leads me to thinking about all these articles I've read where people said that they really enjoyed National Novel Writing Month. And then I'm like, well, where's the discrepancy here? So I do another free write and I highlight something from there. And so from there, I would say, okay, so what's going on with the people who drop out? What do I know already about them? This is a great way to do a research inventory. It's not necessarily a way to get a structured outline. So typically we do free write very early on when we're trying to brainstorm and just get ideas. And then we use some other technique to organize those ideas. Which brings me to cluster mapping. So if you're a visual person, then you probably prefer visual methods of organizing your ideas. For myself, I don't really like clustering because I find it messy and confusing, and I like the orderliness of a list. But for you, that might not be the case. Many people prefer to use clustering because they like the freedom to go any direction on a page. So it's often on an unlined page. So here I've done a cluster map of this project. So I've got my question, is it an effective teaching tool? And my hypothesis is probably not, actually. And that I've got three things that I've branched off. I've got an original research method, what am I going to do to contribute to the conversation? I've got theory, which is what do I know about how people learn how to be writers? And then I've got what are people actually saying about National Novel Writing Month specifically? So here I've got three possible methods I can use. I can use my personal observations, I can interview student participants, and I can survey participants. Now, I intend for this project ultimately to do a mix of these, and that's fine, but it's important that I keep that inventory in mind. Here I've got my what have people already said about how people learn how to write, and it's the same information from the previous slides, but it's organized in a visual way. And then here I've got what are people already saying, and I've got two kinds of things. I've got studies, formal observations, and then I've got personal essays where people just say what their experience was. And so I can organize it this way. One of the advantages of the cluster map is at the end of this week, you're going to turn in a formal outline to me that tells me what it is you're planning to say and in what order and so on in your formal paper. A cluster map translates into a formal outline easily. So we can take this cluster map and we can say the center thing is my main point, and then the each thing branching off from the center thing, I've got three of them, becomes tier 1 here, and then each thing branching off from those becomes evidence that I can use underneath that, except in the case of this one where I have two branches, and so I can make another layer for that. and that's fine. And you notice it translates directly. I literally copy pasted out of the Smart Art tool from PowerPoint to do that. And then I realized that it didn't really make sense to put my research method first when I need to establish the theory and what's already been said. And so I was able to simply copy paste things around and move things into where they would go in my formal outline. So it's actually a pretty simple technique. Some basic outlining tips. Be flexible. You don't have to write your outline in order. Obviously, I didn't in that case. Be sure to include your sources and your evidence. So make sure that you always make a note, at least a last name, if not also a page number or a quotation of what you're looking at. Be sure to consider claims, reasons, evidence, and warrants as a structure. We'll talk about that in more detail later. But the great thing about an outline is it's a quick way to look at your structure and see if it's working. So I called this a genre focus, and again, you're going, why is this genre? So genres often exist in connection to other genres in a network, and we call those genre systems. And so these genre systems are genres that are dependent upon each other, or that are in some other way intimately related to each other. Outlines and clusters and so on are their own genres. They have their own sets of expectations and formatting conventions and style conventions. We recognize what it is when we see it. But in this case, they're in service of some other thing. So your outline or your cluster might be in service of your essay, or if you're writing a story, it might be in service of a story. The point is that they're related to something else. So, key points for this video. When you're planning, consider your strengths and your processes and use methods for planning that play to those strengths. Use visual methods if you're a visual learner, and so on and so forth. You can easily convert one kind of plan to another as needed. Some take a little more translation, but some are just a matter of just copying the information over into the new format. And be very thorough with your outlines. So include your reasons, include your evidence, and consider even including warrants wherever that's necessary. And we'll talk about what warrants are later.